61% of the country is in drought right now. That's the highest share ever recorded by the US Drought Monitor in 26 years of weekly tracking. On April 22nd, 183 fires ignited across that drought. The National Interagency Fire Center confirmed the count in its daily situation report for April 22nd. 6 of those fires were immediately classified as large incidents in one operational period. That's 6 new fires large enough to require federal coordination opened inside the same 24-hour window. The Storm Prediction Center followed up by designating critical fire weather across the southern high plains for April 23rd. Before we go further, if you want this kind of investigation while it's still unfolding, subscribe to the Science Studio. Drop your state in the comments. The fire weather this week didn't hit every region the same way, and we want to hear where you are. Now back to that number. 183 fires in a day works out to roughly 1 new ignition every 8 minutes, around the clock. That's not a regional event. That's fires starting in Colorado, in Nebraska, in Kansas, in Oklahoma, in the Texas Panhandle, in South Dakota, all at the same time. The National Weather Service office in North Platte reported humidity dropping to as low as 10% across western Nebraska during the outbreak. That's roughly the same moisture level as a piece of kiln-dried lumber sitting in a hardware store. The Storm Prediction Center used a word that forecasters almost never use. The word is critical. The SPC issues fire weather outlooks every day, and most days the highest tier on the map is elevated. Critical is the next step up. It means the conditions on the ground can support a fire that doubles in size in under an hour. Above critical sits one more tier called extremely critical, and that one gets issued only in the rarest outbreaks. For April 23rd, the SPC placed a critical fire weather area across the southern high plains. That zone covers parts of Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, and the Texas Panhandle. Red flag warnings went up across 12 or more states simultaneously. A red flag warning isn't a forecast of fire, it's a notification from the National Weather Service that the conditions required for extreme fire behavior are already in place. Those conditions are humidity at or below 15% and sustained winds of 25 miles per hour or higher. Nebraska on April 22nd blew past both thresholds with room to spare. Humidity fell to 10%. Winds gusted to 50 miles per hour. Oklahoma and Kansas saw gusts of 30 to 35 miles per hour on the same day. These aren't freak readings in one isolated spot. They're the surrounding air across hundreds of thousands of square miles. That's why 183 separate ignitions could take hold in a single day, spread across multiple states, with no single storm or lightning event tying them together. The National Interagency Fire Center runs a 5-level preparedness scale for the country. Level 1 is routine. Level 5 is all federal fire resources committed. Level 2 means fire activity is already building across multiple geographic areas, and crews are being pulled from one region to cover another. The country moved to Level 2 on March 20th, and it has stayed there ever since. By April 23rd, that's 34 straight days at elevated readiness. The last time we were at Level 1 was over a month before this week's outbreak even began. Most coverage reported a dangerous weather pattern arriving over dry land. The actual NIFC data shows something different. The fires were already building. The preparedness level had been elevated for 5 weeks. The drought had already hit a 26-year record before the first red flag warning went up this week. On April 3rd, 3 weeks before April 22nd, the NIFC situation report listed 11 large fires already uncontained, with 1,200 personnel deployed. That's not a pattern arriving. That's a pattern that was already here. The window forecasters are watching right now closes fast. The SPC's critical designation for April 23rd carries through the afternoon and evening hours. Once humidity drops to 10% and wind hits 50 miles per hour, a single ignition source can start a fire that covers miles before the first tanker aircraft gets airborne. The NWS North Platte office included specific language in the red flag warning about the potential for dry thunderstorms. A dry thunderstorm produces lightning without rainfall. That means ignition without any wetting of the surrounding fuels. If you're watching this from Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, South Dakota, or the Texas Panhandle, the air over your head right now is the same air feeding every fire on the NIFC map. The wind-moving grass and crop residue across your county is the same wind-moving flame fronts in the next county over. The humidity reading at your nearest airport is the same humidity reading that defines whether a spark becomes a fire or a fire becomes an incident. The people making decisions at the NIFC, the SPC, And the individual state forestry agencies aren't responding to a future event. They're responding to something already in motion. 183 fires in a day is the number that reached the situation report. That number doesn't include small ignitions that local crews knocked down before they made the federal tally. It doesn't include fires that started after midnight on April 22nd and got counted in the next operational period. It's a floor, not a ceiling. And it landed inside a fire season that hasn't officially started yet across most of the affected region. Peak fire behavior in the high plains typically arrives in late May and June, when grass cures out and the heat climbs. This week is running 5 to 6 weeks ahead of that schedule. The grasses are already cured, the soil moisture is already depleted, the snowpack that normally feeds groundwater into summer is already gone across 8 western states. Every one of those conditions was documented before April 22nd. The 183 fire day wasn't the beginning of the emergency. It was the visible surface of a system that had been running hot for weeks. The elevated preparedness level, the record drought, the early season heat, the dry lightning, they all arrived in the same corridor at the same time. The reason this matters to a viewer in the middle of the country right now is that everything downstream of a fire emergency, the power grid, the water supply, the air quality, the road access, runs through the same corridor the fire weather is hitting. When 12 states are under red flag warnings on the same day, every piece of infrastructure in those 12 states is operating inside the same emergency. The decisions being made at utility control rooms, at state emergency operation centers, and at the NIFC coordination desk are all being made against the same clock, and that clock is still running. 61% of the lower 48 is in drought, a number the US Drought Monitor has not recorded in 26 years of tracking. 61% of the lower 48 in drought is not a seasonal reading. It's the highest early spring drought coverage in the entire history of the US Drought Monitor, which began tracking this in 2000. That's 26 years of continuous weekly readings, and April 16, 2026 set the record. When you fold in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, 51% of total US land area is in drought as of the same date. The monitor publishes new readings every Tuesday. Each reading reflects soil moisture, stream flow, vegetation stress, groundwater levels, and precipitation over the preceding weeks. For 61% of the lower 48 to hit the drought threshold simultaneously, the dryness has to be continuous across the middle of the country, through the southern plains and deep into the west. That's exactly what the April 16th reading showed. The drought isn't pocketed in one region. It's a continuous footprint from the Sierra Nevada across the Rockies, over the high plains, and down into the Gulf states. When forecasters track drought, they expect gradual seasonal build-up through winter. 99% of Oklahoma was already in drought by March 31st. That's every county in the entire state, 77 counties, without enough moisture in the soil to slow a fire. Oklahoma sits directly upwind of Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, and wind moves fire faster than most people can drive on a highway. 8 western states all set their lowest snowpack records on the same date, April 1st. The March 31st reading wasn't an outlier. NOAA confirmed 89% of Texas was in drought on the same date. Texas and Oklahoma together cover 439,000 square miles, and nearly all of it was classified as dry soil, stressed vegetation, and reduced stream flow before April even began. The fuel for April 22nd's 183 fire day was already on the ground on March 31st. The only thing missing was the wind event that would turn that fuel into ignitions, and that arrived 3 weeks later. Record March heat fueled the rapid drought expansion across the southern plains. Temperatures ran 12 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above normal across western Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle during the week of April 8th through April 14th. That's not a warm spell. That's a heat event that evaporates soil moisture at roughly twice the normal rate for that time of year. Under those conditions, any ground that entered spring already dry loses its remaining moisture in days, not weeks. The drought went from severe to extreme across large parts of the southern plains during that single heat event. NOAA's Southern Plains Drought Status Update from April 2nd contained one plain sentence that tells you the scale of what preceded this week. The agency described the storm system that moved through on April 2nd as the first substantial storm this spring. That means the entire region, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and parts of New Mexico, went through the months of January, February, and most of March and early April without a single storm that delivered meaningful rainfall. A region that normally gets 8 to 10 measurable precipitation events in that window received one. When forecasters track the western snowpack, April 1st is the date that matters. The US Department of Agriculture's SNOTEL network, which is a system of automated snow measurement stations across the Mountain West, takes its peak season reading on that day. The snowpack typically peaks right around April 1st because after that, melt outpaces new accumulation. The April 1st reading tells water managers, fire managers, and farmers how much water will be available through the summer. In 2026, that reading came in at record lows across 8 western states at the same time: Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. All 8 set new record low April 1st snowpack values since SNOTEL monitoring began in the 1980s. That's 40-plus years of continuous readings, and 2026 was the worst simultaneous multi-state failure in that entire record. California came in at its second lowest April 1st snowpack ever recorded. The whole western fire corridor from the Mexican border up through the Pacific Northwest entered spring with its natural water bank nearly empty. Most coverage framed this as a drought year. The confirmed data shows something different. The last time early spring drought coverage in the lower 48 came anywhere close to 61% was during the 2012 drought, and even then the coverage peaked later in the season. This reading hit in April. That puts the country roughly 2 to 3 months ahead of the worst drought years on record for pace of expansion. The 26-year record isn't a close call, it's a clear, documented first. The pattern that produced it is straightforward. Warm, dry winter across most of the West. Below average precipitation across the southern plains. Record March heat through Oklahoma and Texas. A snowpack that failed to accumulate normally and then melted out early. Those are 4 separate indicators, measured by 4 separate systems, all pointing the same direction at the same time. That's why the Drought.gov weekly update described the spring 2026 snow drought as widespread and severe, a phrase the agency uses sparingly. The consequence on the ground is that the dead grass from last year's growing season never got wet enough over winter to compress and decay. It stayed standing and dry through the winter. The new spring grass didn't green up the way it normally would, because there's no moisture in the soil to support it. What you end up with across the southern plains is a landscape covered in last year's dead grass, with this year's sparse new grass mixed in. That mix is what fire scientists call cured fine fuel. It ignites easily, burns fast, and carries flame from one patch to the next at the speed of the wind. Oklahoma's 99% drought coverage on March 31st isn't a forecast, it's an inventory. Every county, every wheat field, every pasture, every roadside ditch contains fuel that's already dry enough to carry fire. When NWS North Platte issued its red flag warning for April 22nd, with 10% humidity and 50-mile-per-hour winds, the only variable left was ignition. The fuel side of the equation was solved 3 weeks earlier. California's snowpack is the water supply for roughly 30 million people, and its April 1st reading came in at the second lowest ever recorded. The state's reservoirs depend on snowmelt runoff from April through July to carry municipal, agricultural, and environmental water needs through the dry summer. A second lowest reading means the runoff forecast for this summer has already been revised downward. Central Valley agriculture, which grows a meaningful share of the country's produce, enters the 2026 season with less water allocation than any year in the last decade except one. The Southern Plains got its first significant storm of the entire spring on April 2nd. That one storm didn't reverse the drought. NOAA's own update described it as a short-term relief event, not a pattern change. The days after the storm were warmer than normal again, and the moisture it delivered evaporated quickly under the ongoing heat. By mid-April, the short-term drought footprint was already expanding again, and the April 16th Drought Monitor reading captured that expansion in the 61% number. What this adds up to is a situation where the landscape that caught fire on April 22nd wasn't a landscape that had just turned dry. It was a landscape that had been dry for months, got drier during a record heat event, and then met wind gusts of 50 miles per hour with humidity at 10%. The 183 fire day didn't happen to the country. The country was arranged for it. The drought covering the western plains right now didn't build over winter. It accelerated during a single month. That single month was March, and what accelerated inside it wasn't just the dryness. It was the physical state of the fuel on the ground. Grass that was merely brown in February was brittle and hollow by the end of March. The fine fuel, which is the term fire scientists use for grass, leaves, small twigs, and crop residue, was primed to carry flame at a rate that defeats standard firefighting strategies. The National Weather Service's red flag warning criteria require 2 conditions to be met simultaneously: relative humidity at or below 15%, and sustained winds of 25 miles per hour or higher. Those thresholds aren't arbitrary. They're the conditions under which fire behavior becomes erratic, spotting over containment lines, carrying embers hundreds of yards downwind, and outpacing ground crews on foot. Nebraska, on April 22nd, hit 10% humidity and 50-mile-per-hour gusts. That's 5 percentage points below the humidity threshold and double the wind threshold. The conditions weren't just met, they were exceeded. When humidity is at 10%, the moisture in cured grass drops to roughly 4 to 6% of its dry weight. At that level, grass doesn't just burn, it ignites from a glowing ember with no open flame required. A cigarette thrown from a car window will start a fire. A spark from a chain hitting pavement behind a trailer will start a fire. Friction from a drag safety chain along asphalt will start a fire. The ignition threshold is that low. That's why 183 fires started in one day across such a wide geography. The human activities that would be harmless in normal conditions become ignition sources. Most people picture wildfire suppression as aircraft dropping retardant on a visible flame. The National Wildfire Coordinating Group's fire behavior standards confirm a fire in 50-mile-per-hour winds and 10% humidity can double in 60 minutes. That means a fire that starts the size of a football field becomes the size of a neighborhood before the first tanker is wheels up. In the Texas Panhandle and western Kansas, the nearest air tanker base may be 90 minutes away under normal routing. The SPC's critical designation carries a specific meaning in fire weather forecasting. It means the combination of fuel, humidity, wind, and temperature are projected to support what forecasters call rapid rates of spread and extreme fire behavior. In plain language, a fire under critical conditions moves faster than ground crews can respond, burns hotter than hand tools can manage, and throws embers far enough to start new fires well ahead of the main fire front. One level above critical sits extremely critical, and the SPC reserves that designation for the rarest conditions. It gets issued only a handful of times in most years, and sometimes not at all. The February 2026 outbreak was designated extremely critical. Wind hit 70 miles per hour. When fire managers talk about the difference between a fire that can be caught and a fire that can't, they're usually talking about what happens in the first hour. A fire under normal weather conditions, with humidity above 30% and winds below 15 miles per hour, can often be contained by a local crew within that first hour. A fire under critical conditions doubles in size in that same hour. A fire under extremely critical conditions with dry thunderstorm activity can triple. The math is simple. The ground response doesn't scale at the same rate as the fire. The crop residue and grass that carry these fires aren't evenly distributed. They're concentrated in agricultural corridors and grassland ecosystems. The Flint Hills of Kansas, the Sand Hills of Nebraska, the shortgrass prairie of eastern Colorado, and the winter wheat belt of Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle are all classic fine fuel environments. Under normal moisture conditions, these landscapes burn in controlled prescribed fires every spring as part of ranch and grassland management. Under critical or extremely critical conditions, the same landscapes don't stop burning at the property line. One more element matters here. The wind doesn't just push the fire, it carries embers. Under 50-mile-per-hour winds, NIFC fire behavior guidance confirms a fire can throw burning material a quarter mile to a full mile ahead of its main front. Those embers land on new fuel, start new fires, and the process repeats. That's called spot fire activity, and it's what defeats containment lines. Ground crews can build a fire break across a road or a ploughed field. Embers crossing that break with the wind render the break useless within minutes. In the Texas Panhandle, the spacing between rural fire departments averages roughly 25 to 30 miles. That's the normal response radius for a first arriving engine. Under critical conditions, a fire can outrun that response radius before the engine leaves the station. In western Kansas, the spacing is similar. In the Sand Hills of Nebraska, it's wider. The physical geography of the region, combined with the current fire weather, means some fires will grow to thousands of acres before any organized ground response reaches them. That's the operational reality fire managers are working inside right now. The preparedness level reflects it. The NIFC situation reports reflect it. The SPC outlooks reflect it. The NWS red flag warnings reflect it. Every agency in the chain is looking at the same data and issuing the same warnings. The question isn't whether the system is aware of the threat. The question is whether the firefighting capacity can match the ignition rate under these specific conditions across 12 states at the same time. The US Forest Service raised the national preparedness level on March 20th, 5 weeks before this week's fire weather outbreak. Most coverage told viewers a dangerous pattern arrived over dry land. The drought was already at a 26-year record before the pattern arrived. The preparedness level had already been elevated. The pattern didn't arrive. It was already here. NOAA's Southern Plains Drought Status. Update from April 2nd explicitly stated the region received its first substantial storm this spring. That means the entire pre-fire season passed without meaningful moisture. The NIFC, the SPC, and the Drought Monitor were all publishing the same trajectory in real time. The 183 fire day was visible in their reports 34 days before it landed. The US Forest Service raised the national fire danger level 34 days before this week's outbreak. 34 days is long enough to preposition aircraft, restock tanker bases, and reposition ground crews. On April 3rd, 11 large fires were already uncontained. Most Americans hadn't heard of a single one. The NIFC's April 3rd situation report confirmed those 11 uncontained large fires, with 1,200 personnel deployed. Each of those fires had its own incident management structure, its own evacuation zones in some cases, and its own resource draw from the national pool. They weren't clustered in one state. They were spread across the West and the Southern Plains, and they were already burning 3 weeks before April 22nd added 183 new ignitions to the map in a single day. When you read the NIFC reports in sequence, the progression is clear. Level 1 through most of February, Level 2 on March 20th, 11 uncontained large fires by April 3rd, 183 new ignitions on April 22nd, 6 new large incidents opened in a single operational period. That's not a spike, that's a curve. And the curve has been visible in the public daily situation reports the entire time. 34 days at Level 2 is long enough to exhaust the rest cycles of every rotating ground crew in the system. 11 large fires were burning uncontained 3 weeks before this week's outbreak. That single sentence contains the reframe. The public messaging cycle in most media outlets treats each fire weather event as a new story, independent of what came before it. The data treats it as continuous, the same system, the same drought, the same preparedness elevation, the same fuel conditions, carrying forward from week to week with worsening readings at each update. The USFS defined Level 2 in plain terms. The USFS confirmed that Level 2 is activated when, quote, more large wildland fires are burning throughout the country, requiring resources to be mobilized from different areas. That's not a warning about future fires. That's a description of current activity. On March 20th, the resource mobilization across geographic areas was already underway. By April 23rd, it had been underway for 34 days. Inside those 34 days, the drought footprint expanded. The early season heat hit record levels. The snowpack peaked at record lows on April 1st. The Southern Plains received one storm. The fine fuel cured across 12 states. The preparedness system stayed at Level 2 the entire time. Every data point pointed the same direction. Every agency tracking the relevant indicator published the relevant reading. The NIFC, the SPC, the NWS, the USGS, the USDA, NOAA, and Drought.gov all confirmed the trajectory in parallel. Each agency published its reading on schedule, the Drought.gov update, the NIFC situation report, the Snowtel snapshot. None of them pointed to each other. Individually, a snowpack reading, a drought reading, a preparedness level, and a large fire count each look like a separate report. Together, they describe a single compounding system. The reframe here is that this week's 183 fire day wasn't the event. It was the visible surface of the event. The event itself started on March 20th when Level 2 was declared, or arguably earlier, when the snowpack failed to accumulate through the winter. The communication gap has a practical consequence. A homeowner in western Kansas, a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, or a utility operator in Oklahoma reading the news on April 22nd would have encountered the 183 fire headline as a sudden event. The fact that the same trajectory had been building in public agency reports for 34 days doesn't usually make the front page until the big number lands. By then, the time to prepare is measured in hours, not days or weeks. The preparation window that existed in March was never widely translated into the consumer news cycle. That's not a criticism of any single outlet. It's a description of how fire weather information flows in this country. The technical agencies publish in their own channels. The NIFC situation report goes to fire management professionals, state emergency coordinators, and the federal and state fire agencies. The public version of that information appears in local news coverage when there's a visible incident to attach it to. When the incident hasn't happened yet, the public-facing signal is muted. When 183 incidents happen in one day, the signal becomes unmissable. 34 days at level 2 without returning to level 1 is long enough to deplete crew rest cycles. Wildland firefighters work on mandatory rest rotations. Too many consecutive days at elevated deployment rates and crews cycle off the line for recovery, which reduces the effective response capacity even while the incident load is still climbing. The NIFC manages that rotation, but the underlying math is unforgiving. The longer the system runs hot, the harder it is to surge further when conditions escalate. A country that's been at level 2 for 34 days has less slack in the system than a country that just arrived at level 2 yesterday. The NIFC, the SPC, the NWS, and the state forestry services tracked every relevant indicator and published it publicly the entire time. The reframe is about what the public sees versus what the data shows. The public saw a sudden 183 fire outbreak. The data shows a 34-day continuous escalation, with every indicator moving in the same direction at the same time. The NIFC reports show a 34-day curve. The news cycle shows a single day. One of those is the confirmed record. This is why the phrase record drought matters in context. It doesn't mean a single hot, dry year. It means the US Drought Monitor, which has been tracking continuously since 2000, has never recorded this much early spring drought coverage in the lower 48 in its entire 26-year history. The record isn't close. It's a clear first. That record was set on April 16th, 6 days before the 183 fire day. The drought record came first. The fire weather followed the drought record. The preparedness level followed both. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center issued its February through April drought outlook in late January 2026. That outlook projected below normal drought probability across the southern plains for the February through April period. The April 16th Drought Monitor reading showed 61% of the lower 48 in drought, the highest early spring reading in 26 years of tracking. The CPC forecast and the confirmed Drought Monitor reading point in opposite directions. 8 states set their lowest snowpack records on April 1st, and what that snowpack feeds in summer is a different crisis entirely. That different crisis is water. The snowpack isn't just a winter sports story, it's the West's water bank. And when 8 states hit record lows on the same date, the bank runs empty at the same time. The crisis that follows runs from May through October, and it affects water supply, agricultural output, reservoir levels, water-powered electricity generation, and fire behavior all at once. 8 states set record low April 1st snowpack values in 2026: Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. That's the worst simultaneous multi-state snowpack failure since SNOWTEL monitoring began in the 1980s. SNOWTEL is the automated network of snow measurement stations run by the USDA across the Mountain West. The system has more than 900 stations. It publishes readings daily. The April 1st reading is the one that matters most for annual water planning because it captures the peak snow water equivalent before melt season begins. Snowpack is the American West's natural water bank. It melts slowly through spring and summer, feeding rivers, recharging reservoirs, and keeping vegetation green into July and August. When snowpack is at record lows on April 1st, the natural moisture that normally slows peak fire season is simply not there. The entire moisture supply chain that carries green vegetation from spring into late summer depends on the April 1st reading. If the peak reading is low, the river flows are low, the soil moisture is low, and the vegetation dries weeks ahead of schedule. Snowpack is the West's primary fire buffer from May through August. When it fails on April 1st, the vegetation that would still be green in June starts drying in April. 8 states hit their record low on that date, and that date has already passed. That means peak fire behavior, the kind that defeats aircraft and ground crews, arrives weeks earlier than firefighting systems are staffed to handle. California's April 1st snowpack came in at its second lowest reading ever recorded. The State Department of Water Resources takes manual measurements at Phillips Station in the central Sierra Nevada as part of the traditional April 1st survey. Those measurements, combined with SNOWTEL readings across the range, set the statewide water supply forecast for the year. A second lowest reading means the California State Water Project and the Federal Central Valley Project, which together supply most of the state's agricultural and municipal water, both issued reduced allocations for 2026. The runoff forecast is what drives water management decisions for the rest of the year. When the April 1st reading is low, every reservoir downstream sees a reduced inflow projection. Lake Mead, Lake Powell, and the Colorado River system all depend on snowpack in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. All 4 of those states hit records in 2026. That means the Colorado River Basin, which supplies water to roughly 40 million people across 7 states and Mexico, entered 2026 with the worst simultaneous headwater snowpack on record. The peak has passed. The water that wasn't stored on April 1st cannot be stored. That's the physical reality of the snowpack system. Late-season storms can add small amounts to the pack, but the bulk of the accumulation happens in the core winter months of December, January, and February. By April, most of the seasonal storage is already in place, and the melt curve takes over. If the April 1st number is low, every subsequent week loses water to run off faster than any late storm can replace it. For fire behavior, the snowpack connection runs through soil moisture. As snow melts in late spring and early summer, the water soaks into the ground, saturating the top few feet of soil. That saturated soil keeps grass and brush green for weeks after the snow is gone. In a normal year, the Rocky Mountain front doesn't cure out until late June or July. In 2026, with record low snowpack, the curing date moves up. By early June, the fuel that normally supports peak fire behavior in July will already be in peak condition. The countdown here is real and short. April 1st has passed. May arrives in days. Peak fire season across the Rocky Mountain West traditionally runs from June through September. In 2026, that window is shifting earlier. NIFC and the USFS are already planning for an extended fire season that starts in April, peaks in June and July, and continues into October. That's a 26-week season. The crew rotation, aircraft maintenance, and resource supply chains for the federal fire system are built around an 18 to 20-week peak season schedule. The water side of the crisis runs on a different timeline but the same underlying mechanism. When reservoirs enter summer with less water flowing in, managers have to choose between 3 competing demands: municipal water supply, agricultural irrigation, environmental flows for rivers and fisheries. In low snowpack years, one or more of those demands gets cut. In 2026, with 8 states at record lows simultaneously, multiple reservoir systems will face simultaneous cuts across the same water year. Western water-powered electricity generation depends on water flowing through dams. When reservoir levels drop, generation capacity drops with them. The Western Area Power Administration and the Bonneville Power Administration both provide significant shares of regional electrical supply from hydroelectric facilities. In low snowpack years, those facilities generate less. The shortfall gets made up by natural gas and, in some markets, coal generation. That means electricity prices tend to rise in low snowpack years, and they tend to rise across a wide region simultaneously. The Drought.gov April 9th update said it plainly. The agency didn't call it a indicator, it called it the primary indicator. For spring runoff forecasting, the April 1st snow water equivalent is the single most important number. 8 states failed that number simultaneously. It's a coordinated indicator failure across nearly the entire western half of the country. The water that wasn't in the snowpack on April 1st cannot be replaced before summer. That's the fact fire managers and water managers are both planning around right now. The suppression side and the supply side are linked. A fire that burns through a watershed strips the vegetation that holds soil in place. When the next rain does come, that soil washes into reservoirs as sediment. A reservoir that loses storage capacity to sediment loses it permanently in many cases. So a big fire season in a low snowpack year compounds the water problem for years afterward. The drought wasn't building in isolation. The snowpack wasn't failing in isolation. The preparedness level wasn't elevated in isolation. These are the same system failing at multiple points simultaneously. The 183 fire day is downstream of all of them. The snowpack failure across 8 states is the upstream variable that determines how the rest of 2026 plays out. Once April 1st passes with record low readings, the fire season, the water season, and the power season are all running on a different script than a normal year. A satellite cluster recorded 291 confirmed fire detections across the central United States on April 19th, 3 days before the 183 fire day. 291 satellite fire detections on April 19th means the outbreak was already forming 3 days before the NIFC situation report recorded 183 new ignitions. That detection cluster was centered on the Arkansas-Missouri border region. and it overlapped directly with the same geographic corridor where severe weather had produced tornado warnings 48 hours earlier. The fire footprint and the tornado footprint weren't separate events in separate places. They were the same storm system, affecting the same corridor, in two different ways. When a major storm system moves through, people assume the rain helps. The storms split. The east got rain, the west got wind. The western high plains from the Texas Panhandle to the Nebraska Sandhills received the gusts that dry the soil, without the rain that would have slowed ignition. Crop residue from winter wheat fields in drought-stressed Oklahoma is now among the driest fine fuel in the country, lying flat across the landscape with nothing between it and a 50-mile-per-hour wind. The 291 fire detections on April 19th didn't appear in the Rockies or the California chaparral. They appeared in the middle of the country. When the warm, moist Gulf air collides with dry continental air from the Rockies, the eastern side of the front gets severe thunderstorms. The western side gets the dry downslope winds. NWS North Platte's red flag warning language confirmed the dry lightning potential for western Nebraska during the April 22nd event. NOAA's March climate reports and multiple state climate offices confirmed the same pattern had been building across the west. At the same time, severe weather was targeting the eastern plains earlier in the month. The heatwave on the western side of the Rockies and the severe weather on the eastern side of the plains weren't separate stories. They were two halves of the same continental pattern. The 291 satellite fire detections on April 19th appeared in the same corridor where tornado warnings had been active 48 hours earlier. That's the information asymmetry on the second topic. Coverage of severe weather events typically focuses on tornadoes, hail, and flash flooding. Those are the visible destructive consequences on the eastern side of the system. The western side of the same system, which produces the fire weather, gets reported separately if it gets reported at all. The viewer watching tornado coverage on Monday may not connect it to fire coverage on Wednesday. The data connects them directly. When the wind comes across that landscape at 50 miles per hour, any ignition source, a spark from farm equipment, a lightning strike from a dry thunderstorm, a downed power line, a chain dragging behind a trailer, can start a fire that crosses a township in minutes. The fuel is flat, continuous, and oriented with the prevailing wind direction. There are no natural fire breaks. The section line roads and ploughed fields that normally serve as breaks are often too narrow to stop a fire under these conditions. Embers simply jump them. The NIFC tracks satellite fire detections alongside its ground-reported incident counts. The 291 high-confidence detections on April 19th predated the 183 incident count by 3 days. Some of those satellite hot pixels resolved into small fires that local crews extinguished before they reached the federal situation report. Some of them resolved into the 6 new large incidents that opened on April 22nd. The outbreak that appeared in the April 22nd situation report as a single big number was actually the culmination of a detection curve that started climbing several days earlier. The connection to the tornado corridor matters operationally. Emergency management in the plain states is organized around severe weather response. Tornado sirens, storm spotter networks, and emergency broadcast systems are all built for the eastern side of the corridor. The western side, where fire weather dominates, has a different response infrastructure. Rural fire departments, state forestry divisions, and the federal interagency system cover a geography that's largely rural, with response times measured in miles rather than minutes. When a storm system dumps tornadoes in the east and fire weather in the west simultaneously, both response systems are activated at the same time across adjacent counties. Winter wheat residue in 99% drought Oklahoma is currently the most available fire fuel in the country. That's the operational reality fire managers in the southern plains are working with. A fire that starts in a wheat field in western Oklahoma has continuous fuel to carry it across the state line into Kansas, up into Nebraska, or east into the agricultural belt of Missouri. The political boundaries on a map don't appear in the fuel layer. The wind and the fuel do what they do regardless of state lines. The Tornado fire whiplash on April 22nd is what made this event different from a typical spring weather pattern. In a normal year, tornadoes and fires don't happen in the same week across the same geography. Tornado season in the southern plains typically peaks in late April through May. Fire season in the same region peaks from late February through March, and then fades as greenup begins. In 2026, the greenup didn't happen. The grass stayed cured, the wheat residue stayed dry, and the tornado pattern arrived on top of a landscape that was still configured for fire. That configuration is why the satellite fire detection count rose before the ground-reported incident count. The system was already producing ignitions from the dry line passages, the gusty winds, and the occasional dry lightning cell. The ground-reported count caught up 3 days later when the April 22nd outbreak pushed 6 of those ignitions into large incident status simultaneously. From a fire weather standpoint, April 19th was the leading edge. April 22nd was the visible peak. NOAA's March climate reports and multiple state climate offices had already confirmed the 3-part pattern. Record heat in the west, severe weather building in the east, drought expanding across the middle, 3 readings from 3 regions, all published separately, all pieces of the same continental scale setup. By April 22nd, all 3 had converged into a single operational emergency. Air quality is one of the downstream consequences. Smoke from fires in the Central Plains doesn't stay in the Central Plains. Under the same westerly winds that carry the fire, smoke plumes track east into the Missouri River Valley, the Ozarks, and the Ohio River Valley. A fire burning in western Kansas on a day with 50-mile-per-hour west winds can put smoke over Kansas City, St. Louis, and Cincinnati within 24 hours. Air quality alerts in those cities can be triggered by fires hundreds of miles away. The National Preparedness System has 5 levels. The country is at Level 2. Level 3 requires a formal declaration. The red flag warning active over your state right now does not protect you. It tells you the conditions for an uncontrollable fire already exist. That's the first piece of information most viewers don't have in the right frame. A red flag warning isn't like a tornado warning, where the hazard might pass over or might not. A red flag. Warning confirms the hazard is present across the entire warned area for the entire duration of the warning. Every dry creek bed, every cured wheat field, every cedar grove inside the warning area is currently in a state where a single ignition source can produce an uncontrollable fire. A red flag warning is a notification, not a protective measure. It confirms that the conditions already exist. For a viewer in Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, or the Texas Panhandle, the 50-mile-per-hour winds and 10% humidity, confirmed by NWS North Platte, mean that a fire starting anywhere upwind of your community can reach your neighborhood before a containment line can be established. 50 miles per hour wind moves a grass fire at roughly 4 to 6 miles per hour across flat terrain. A fire that starts 20 miles upwind of your house can reach your property line in under 4 hours. A fire 40 miles upwind can contaminate your tap water for 6 months. That's the distance from downtown Wichita to the edge of the Flint Hills, a grassland currently rated at extreme fire risk. A reservoir catchment burned in a major fire takes 18 to 36 months to return to baseline sediment levels, according to the U.S. Forest Service's post-fire watershed assessment protocols. The 6 states currently under red flag warnings include 3 states that share water infrastructure feeding communities well outside the warning zone. The power grid in fire-prone corridors depends on transmission lines running through the same vegetation that's now bone dry. When a fire reaches a transmission corridor, the utility operating that line faces a binary choice: de-energize the line and cut power to thousands of customers, or keep the line energized and risk the line sparking additional ignitions. Both options have consequences. De-energization protects the grid from being destroyed by fire damage, but it also shuts off power for medical equipment in homes, for air conditioning during heat events, for water pumping systems in rural communities. If you're in a rural community, power loss means water loss. Rural water systems depend on electric pumps to lift water from wells and move it through distribution lines. When the pump loses power, the pressure drops. Within hours, taps run dry. Within a day, storage tanks deplete. For a 65 to 70-year-old viewer in a rural community in Oklahoma, Kansas, or the Texas Panhandle, a fire weather event that triggers a public safety power shut-off upstream can mean no running water in your house, even though the fire itself never reaches your county. Air quality is the next layer. A large fire in western Kansas or the Texas Panhandle, under current wind patterns, pushes smoke east into Wichita, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Kansas City. Those are metropolitan areas with combined populations of several million people. Smoke plumes from plains grass fires contain fine particulate matter at levels that trigger air now alerts for sensitive groups, including anyone over 65, anyone with asthma, anyone with COPD, anyone with heart or blood vessel disease, and anyone recovering from recent respiratory illness. The EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards are enforced through these air now monitors, and smoke events routinely push air quality into the orange, red, and sometimes purple categories. For a 65 to 70-year-old viewer with any respiratory condition, a smoke event isn't a minor air quality concern. It's a direct health risk. The American Lung Association and the EPA both confirm that tiny smoke particles cross from the lungs into the bloodstream, raising the risk of heart attack and stroke within 24 to 48 hours of exposure. In a fire weather event of the scale the Plains is seeing this week, smoke alerts across multiple metropolitan areas are a likely downstream consequence within days. Water supply is the longer-term consequence. Reservoir systems in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona are already drawing on reduced snowmelt because of the 8-state snowpack collapse. A fire burning through a watershed strips the vegetation that slows erosion. When rain does eventually fall on that burned watershed, ash and sediment wash into the reservoir instead of staying on the hillsides. The reservoir's storage capacity is reduced by the sediment. The water quality is degraded by the ash. The municipal water treatment plant downstream has to work harder, and in some cases has to temporarily shut down until the incoming water meets treatment standards. The US Forest Service's BAER program, which stands for Burned Area Emergency Response, conducts post-fire watershed assessments and publishes the 18 to 36-month recovery timeline for sediment levels. That's not a guess. That's the documented recovery window for burned watersheds in the western US. For a community like Denver, which draws water from reservoirs fed by burned watersheds from recent fire seasons, the post-fire contamination risk is an active, budgeted concern. The city has invested tens of millions of dollars in watershed restoration in partnership with the Forest Service and Denver Water. Road access is the local-scale consequence. In rural communities across the High Plains, a single road in and out of town isn't unusual. When a fire approaches, that single road becomes the evacuation corridor for residents leaving and the ingress corridor for emergency responders arriving. The two flows share the same road. If the fire crosses the road, both flows stop. Residents get trapped. Responders can't reach the incident. Under the current fire weather conditions, with fires moving at 4 to 6 miles per hour across open grassland and embers jumping ahead of the main fire front, the window to evacuate a rural community can close in under an hour. The transformer serving your neighborhood runs on a wooden pole through boundary grass. The electric distribution system in the Plains states runs through overhead lines attached to wooden poles. A grass fire that crosses under a distribution line can damage the line, burn the pole, and knock out power to a few hundred to a few thousand customers at a time. Repair crews can't enter an active fire area until it's declared safe. That can mean 24 to 72 hours without power for affected customers, in addition to any upstream de-energization decisions made at the transmission level. The aquifer connecting to your tap is the groundwater piece. In the southern plains, the Ogallala, the underground water supply beneath the southern plains, provides drinking water and irrigation for millions of people. The aquifer is recharged by rainfall and in some areas by snowmelt. Under drought conditions, refill rates fall while the amount pulled out for irrigation typically climbs. The aquifer level drops. That's a slow-moving crisis compared to a fire, but it's the underlying water balance that determines how long rural communities can continue drawing from their wells in a multi-year drought. The bridge you cross, if you live in fire country, may sit inside a designated evacuation corridor. County emergency management offices publish these corridors, but most residents haven't looked at them. The corridor is the road network the county plans to use if a major fire forces evacuation of a town. Knowing your corridor, and knowing at least one alternate route, is the single most useful preparation step a rural resident can take before a fire event. For urban and suburban viewers, the equivalent is knowing the wind patterns that bring smoke into your area and understanding which direction the nearest large fuel source sits relative to your home. Under normal conditions, a fire in western Kansas is a Kansas problem. Under 12-state red flag conditions with record drought, record low snowpack, and 34 days at level 2 preparedness, a fire in western Kansas is also an Oklahoma air quality problem, a Missouri smoke problem, a Colorado water supply problem, and a Nebraska power grid problem. The Ogallala, the power grid, and the westerly winds don't stop at state lines. A fire 40 miles upwind can reach your water supply before it reaches your street. It doesn't have to burn your house to change your life. It has to burn your watershed. It has to pass under your transmission line. It has to push enough smoke east to trigger an Air Now alert over Wichita or Kansas City. Under current conditions, fires in the plains are already covering those distances, as confirmed by NIFC large incident acreage reports from February 2026. The national fire preparedness level has a level 3 threshold, and the confirmed number that triggers it has already been exceeded in 2 previous years this decade. What this week reveals isn't visible in any single agency report taken alone. It's visible when you put 6 reports next to each other, The US Drought Monitor has been tracking drought continuously since 2000. 26 years of weekly data. The April 16, 2026 reading showed 61% of the lower 48 in drought, which is the highest early spring coverage in the entire 26-year record. That's not a tie or a near record, it's a first. The SPC's critical designation for April 23rd was one level below the highest fire weather category the agency issues. The extremely critical designation was last issued for the Southern Plains in February 2026, during a wildfire outbreak where 70-mile-per-hour winds drove fires across Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. Oklahoma's governor declared a state of emergency across Beaver, Texas and Woodward counties during that event. That February event is the nearest recent reference point for what this week could become if one more variable shifts. Level 3 in the National Preparedness Scale has a specific numerical trigger. The NIFC Multi-Agency Coordinating Group looks at uncontained large fire counts, total acreage, personnel deployment, and aircraft commitment rate together. That trigger has been reached twice in the last several years during peak season. It has never been reached in April. This April is the first April in the modern record that started with a 26-year drought record, an 8-state snowpack failure, and 34 days at level 2 already on the books before peak season began. The Drought Monitor update schedule is where confirmed data ends and the next 72 hours begin. The monitor publishes a new reading every Tuesday, with data current to the previous Tuesday. The April 16th reading that showed 61% coverage reflected soil moisture conditions as of mid-April, before the April 22nd fire weather event added 50-mile-per-hour winds and 10% humidity to the equation. The next Drought Monitor update will reflect what those conditions did to already depleted soil moisture across the 12-state fire weather footprint. That next reading has not yet been published. When it does publish, it will tell water managers, fire managers, and emergency coordinators what happened to the top layer of soil during the 34 days the country has been at Level 2 preparedness, and specifically what happened during the concentrated wind event of April 22nd and 23rd. If the reading shows continued expansion of the drought footprint, the 61% record will move higher. If the reading shows the same 61% holding, it will confirm the record as an ongoing feature of the 2026 fire season rather than a single bad week. The February 2026 extremely critical event gives us one data point on what those conditions can produce. 70-mile-per-hour winds in February drove a fire outbreak large enough for a state of emergency declaration. The April 23rd critical designation came with 50-mile-per-hour winds and the same underlying drought footprint, expanded further and deeper than it had been in February. The variables the SPC monitors for an extremely critical upgrade include additional wind, further humidity drop, and expansion of the dry fuel layer. All three have been trending in the same direction since March. The crew rotation math changes what Level 3 actually means this year. Wildland firefighters work 2-week deployment cycles with mandatory rest between deployments. A fire season that starts in April and runs through October has 26 weeks in it. Divided by the 2-week cycle, that's 13 deployment rotations per crew, which is already at the upper end of what most crews can sustain while meeting the rest requirements. If additional crews are needed beyond the regular workforce, the options narrow to shared help from federal and state agencies, international cooperation with Canada under existing agreements, and in extreme cases military support. The Drought Monitor will publish its next reading on Tuesday. That reading will tell us what April 22nd and 23rd did to soil moisture across the 12 states inside the fire weather footprint. It will also tell us whether the 61% lower 48 coverage holds, expands, or tips the number above the previous 26-year record. That number is the single most concrete indicator we have for what the rest of 2026 looks like from a drought standpoint. The country entered April 2026 with conditions that had never been recorded together. Not in the 26-year Drought Monitor history, not in the 40-year SNOTEL record, not in the NIFC's Level 2 activation calendar for April, a 26-year record drought footprint, a 40-year record western snowpack failure across 8 states, a 5 to 6 week early elevation of the national fire preparedness level, a 183 fire day on April 22nd, a 12-state red flag footprint on April 23rd. Those are the facts on the record. They're publicly documented. They're available in the daily reports of the agencies that track them. The next US Drought Monitor reading, which will show what this week's fire weather did to soil moisture across 12 states, publishes on Tuesday.